I find there's too much despair in Israel today. I find there's too much despair in the United States of America today. I find there's too much despair in the democratic world today. There is no more effective vehicle for pulling people together, for building community, for doing tikkun olam, for changing the world, and for defending ourselves than modern liberal democratic nationalism.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thank you for joining us. Today, we have an important conversation for you with historian Gil Troy about Zionism, Theodor Herzl, Jewish history, and the future of the Jewish state. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. If you log on to Twitter and see that Zionism is among the trending topics, as is sometimes the case, click on the link only if you have a strong stomach. Though the State of Israel, the embodiment of the vision of Zionism's founder, Theodor Herzl, will celebrate its 75th birthday in a few months, the idea that brought it to life is under siege in the virtual public square as never before. It is no small irony that even as Israel is widely acknowledged to be a regional military superpower and an economic powerhouse, an island of first world achievement in a region where all the other countries are mired in third world poverty and not democracies like Israel. And even as Israel has in recent years broken through the isolation imposed by the ongoing Arab and Muslim boycott that was aimed at its destruction to achieve normal relations with a wider circle of countries, it is at one and the same time the object of a campaign of an international delegitimization aimed at its destruction. In the United States, AntiZionism is now treated as an acceptable, even laudable point of view by some of the leading institutions of American journalism, like the New York Times, where those who oppose the existence of the Jewish state and support those making war on it are regularly published. Many anti-Zionist activists, such as White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre, serve in the Biden administration. And the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is home to a growing number of intersectional leftists who regard Israel as an expression of white privilege and a product of colonialism rather than the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. Rather than treating those politicians, like the members of the congressional squad who embrace these vile stands as pariahs, mainstream Democrats like President Joe Biden make common cause with and praise them. Among American Jewry, the voices of anti-Zionism, which were numerous in the pre-state area but largely silenced in the first decades after the Holocaust and the wars waged by Arab states to destroy Israel, have become louder in recent years. Though still relatively marginal, anti-Zionist groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, are growing in influence and treated by many on the Jewish left as within the range of respectable opinion, even as they traffic in both lies and anti-Semitic blood libels against Jews and Israel, as well as the anti-Semitic BDS movement. Moreover, many on the left, particularly those involved with promoting critical race theory teachings and ethnic studies, are still trying to argue, contrary to the facts and history, that Zionism isn't an integral part of Judaism and Jewish life. We must ask why Israel remains the one country in the world with an international movement devoted to its destruction. Why, 125 years after its founding as a movement and long after the wisdom of its founder was demonstrated by the Shoah, does Zionism remain controversial? Most of the answer lies in the persistence and the strength of the virus of anti-Semitism, and the way Israel and Zionism is now the stand-in for traditional stereotypes and tropes about Jews in light of this troubling fact. Understanding what drove Theodor Herzl to found the Zionist movement and the enormous contributions he made to Jewish life is more important than ever. At a time of rising anti-Semitism, taking a deep dive into Herzl's life, philosophy, and writings is vital. It's also relevant to the ongoing debate about Israel's new government and the attempts by its critics to claim that its composition or policies is somehow a betrayal of the Zionist vision. To discuss all that, we could do no better than to have back with us on Top Story one of the leading Jewish historians of our day and an expert on Herzl. Gil Troy is a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, currently living in Jerusalem. He's an award-winning American presidential historian and a Zionist activist. His most recent publication is as editor of a new 3-volume collection of the Zionist writings of Theodor Herzl, which is the inaugural project of the new Library of the Jewish People. He's also the author of The Zionist Idea, Visions for the Jewish Homeland, which was a 2019 National Jewish Book Award finalist. He's also written 9 books on the American presidency, as well as being the co-author of Natan Sharansky's memoir, Never Alone. Gil Troy, welcome to Top Story.
Honored to be with you, as always.
Well, Gil, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you with us again. I want to start by asking, what was the driving force behind the decision to publish the new Theodor Herzl 3-volume set of his Zionist writing that you edited? Is it just a function of anniversaries, 125th the Zionist movement, Israel's 75th birthday? Or do you believe that Herzl's example and insights are particularly relevant to our situation today?
It's certainly true that we're in the arc of Zionist triumph. I'm calling that the 125th anniversary of the Zionist Congress in August 1897. Then you had we just celebrated the 75th anniversary of November 29th, 1947, which people like to call the partition plan, but I call the UN and world recognition of the right of the Jews to have a state and the acknowledgement that we are a people. And then we're building up to this incredibly important moment of the 75th anniversary of the State of Israel. But I think right now, there's a crisis of liberal nationalism. When I say liberal nationalism, I'm talking about Thomas Jefferson and Ronald Reagan and Lockean nationalism. I'm not talking about partisanship. And there's an understanding among too many people, a false understanding, that nationalism is a dirty word, that nationalism is about building walls and not opening hearts. And Theodor Herzl has a message not just for Jews, not just for Zionists, but for the democratic world, which is that there is no more effective vehicle for pulling people together, for building community, for doing tikkun olam, for changing the world, and for defending ourselves than modern liberal democratic nationalism. And so every author has to be humble enough to understand he or she isn't going to make a difference, but enough of a megalomaniac to stay up night after night working. And my humble megalomaniacal hope is that we'll have a conversation about how to have constructive nationalism. We'll have a conversation in which we see that nationalism isn't something of the left or of the right, but is of the Democrats, lowercase d, those who understand that we have this extraordinary political vision of people voting together, working together, building together. And we don't do it universally. We're not John Lennon singing, "Imagine there are no boundaries, we're a part of a world community." That doesn't work. We are
Which
tribal.
your co-author Natan Sharansky actually took to task in one of his books.
Yes. And so the idea is to have a sense of, wow, we're so lucky. We are part of these constitutive communities, and we can work together and we can change the world and make it a better place. And we have over the last 125 years for the Jewish people, and over the last 3 centuries for Americans, for French people, for so many others.
Yeah, well, I think that's very true. I think there is definitely a debate about nationalism. There are forces, I think, sort of on an international scale that are kind of, there's a liberal critique of nationalism. I think we get a lot of that. It's not just all conspiracy theories about sort of what the World Economic Forum and Davos and Klaus Schwab, what that crowd is preaching, but it's also a question of how do we create nation states with the borders and sovereignty and with popular sovereignty, with the people in those states getting to decide their own fate and yet not be at war with everybody else around them. I mean, that's a, that's a conundrum, but it's not necessarily one. I mean, listen, Winston Churchill was a nationalist, and fighting. It's like nationalism is a good, and that is the whole point of Zionism. But let's talk a bit about Herzl. Many, though perhaps not as many as we would like, know the basic elements of the story of his life, of his witnessing the degradation of Alfred Dreyfus in Paris in the 1890s, the genesis of his book, The Jewish State. But in Israel, I get the sense, let alone among American Jewry, do Jews really know Herzl's story, or is it just ancient history at a time when few know or care what happened even 20 years ago, let alone in the 19th century?
Theodor Herzl in many ways has been reduced to just this image, this very important, stunning image of this man with this beautiful black beard and these piercing black eyes.
Yeah, kind of a hipster beard by today's
right,
standards.
and now people kind of update it. And actually, one of the fascinating things about Herzl, if we talk about his role in modern Israeli politics, is that Bibi Netanyahu, in his recent memoir Bibi, says that his defining hero, the modern Moses, is Herzl. And if we go back almost 10 years ago, little less than 10 years ago, to what they called the cottage cheese rebellion on the Tel Aviv streets, when left-wingers were having protest tents on Rothschild Boulevard, swanky Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv, saying, hey, wait a minute, the cost of living is too high, the cost of rent is too high, the cost of cottage cheese is too high. They kept on having images of Theodor Herzl walking around. They had people dressed up as Theodor Herzl. Had Theodor Herzl on his posters. Now, does that mean that Theodor Herzl is meaningless? No, I argue the opposite. One thing that Israelis understand that the rest of the world often forgets, and the Western world often forgets, both when talking about Israel, but also talking about ourselves, is that you can have deep, passionate, partisan disagreements between Bibi Netanyahu and the lefties of Tel Aviv, but we also understand that we have a common peoplehood platform. We also understand that we have a common history. We also understand we have common enemies. We also understand that we have a common cause, as George Washington called it. And so the fact that Herzl is invoked from left to right doesn't make him meaningless, it makes him meaningful. And that was part of the notion of this project, to go back, and this is part of a very humbly named initiative called the Library of the Jewish People. This is the first 3 volumes of what will be a multi-year project to bring out the great Jewish books, like there's the Library of America. And it's quite significant to me that this man, who only lived 44 years, who died tragically of a heart condition when he was 44 years old in 1904, is still so significant, and his writings are so significant. And it's hard to think of few writers who made such an impact on so many people. We here in Israel today are living a Jewish state and Jewish lives partially due to Theodor Herzl, and Jews throughout the diaspora are living stronger, happier, healthier, more meaningful lives thanks to Theodor Herzl. And of course, Zionism was a group task, but he was the one who got the credit, and he was the one, as the great showman, who was able to launch the story and tell a good story and have that great image.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. His vision, he got the ball rolling in a way that no one had done before, and was this iconic, incredible promotional figure. I think there's so much to go into. And I guess despite his sort of dusty, iconic image, do you think Herzl can be, I think, a uniquely relatable figure for a heavily assimilated American Jewish community, perhaps even more so for Israelis who take Zionism and Jewish identity for granted and maybe don't really relate to this very sophisticated European intellectual who came, as an adult to a realization of that being a Jew was the most important thing in his life.
I think Herzl's journey is something that diaspora Jews and young diaspora Jews can very much relate to, because he is raised to fit in. He is raised to do well. He is raised to get into the best college that he can, and he's in the University of Vienna. He's raised to have a profession, and he becomes a lawyer. And he's raised to kind of transcend all the sorrow and all the humiliation and all the oppression of the Jews. But 2 things happen. One, he can never quite free himself from that ugly ghost of anti-Semitism. But also he realizes that a life without Judaism, a life without peoplehood, a life without his people and his destiny is a life without meaning. And I think to young Jews today, who are on the one hand hounded by this ugly ghost of anti-Semitism again and again and again, but even worse, hounded by demons of meaninglessness and a certain sense of what Emil Durkheim, the great sociologist, called anomie, a loss of identity, which he talks about this over a century ago, how we're anonymous in modern society, in urban society, how we don't have senses of community, we don't have a sense of passion, we don't have a sense of purpose, we don't have a sense of connectedness. I'm not arrogant enough to say that Zionism is the only way or the best way, but it's our way, and it was Herzl's way. And so Herzl's, dare we call it, jujitsu, taking the negative and turning to a positive, not just becoming an anti-Semite, but also becoming a positive, proud Jew. And that's his Zionism, is I think a very important message and image and story for young American Jews and Canadian Jews and British Jews and Israeli Jews to learn.
Yeah, I think it's a remarkable thing. I know there has been an effort in the last couple of decades to sort of promote Herzl more. The Herzl Museum, Mount Herzl, which was kind of a one horse affair for a long time. I was there 15 years ago when they redid it. I don't, we could discuss that. I thought there was a lot of video presentations, seemed a little cheesy to me. I'm not quite sure how relatable those videos were to somebody above the sixth grade level, but I think it's important to tell that story, because I think it is so contemporary in terms of how we live now for people who people living in the diaspora, or people even in Israel searching for their identity. Now, in the course of your research and your work, especially as you go through his writings in detail, are there things that you learned that you hadn't previously known, even though you are, a scholar of Zionism? And are there misconceptions about Herzl that you think that are particularly unhelpful for understanding him and Zionism today?
There's a very important nuance in the Herzl story. And one of the things that we have in the Library of the Jewish People in these beautiful 3 volumes, which I didn't produce, which is why I can call them beautiful. It was the Koren Publishing empire that's now launching this Library of the Jewish People, is we have a translation of a play called The New Ghetto. And that play is written in a burst of playwriting in 3 weeks in 1895, where Herzl, already haunted by the Judenfrage, the Jewish question, is trying to exorcise all this Jewish stuff from his head. And says, I'm going to write a play about the Jewish condition. During those 3 weeks is when the Dreyfus trial takes place. So first of all, it shows that he was already struggling with Jewish identity, with anti-Semitism, with the Judenfrage, even before the Dreyfus trial. But what happens, and here you also see it through the writings, he's trained as a lawyer, but he's an aspiring playwright. So he has the statesman side and he has the showman side. And he understands that you have to tell a story effectively. And so the Dreyfus trial allows him to tell the story of Zionism in 3 easy acts. Act 1, we wanted to assimilate. We left the ghetto. We wanted to belong. Thesis. Act 2, antithesis. They hated us. They rejected us. They framed Dreyfus, and they didn't say down with the individual Captain Dreyfus, who was a French army captain, but no, down with La Juif, down with all the Jews. Yeah, they didn't just come after me as somebody who they didn't like, who they found arrogant or too good looking, who would like to walk into the room and have everybody pay attention to him, but they attacked me as a Jew, as the Jews. And so Act 3 is Zionism, a return home, a return to peoplehood. Now, it's so interesting when we read The New Ghetto, is that there isn't one positive Jewish image in the whole play. Every Jew who appears, and it's a play of Jews, is either too assimilated, too materialistic, too weak, too cowardly, too arrogant. And what happened? I think he writes that play in a fit of despair. The Dreyfus trial sends him even to a deeper despair, but that gives him the break that he needs from his previous life to say, wait a minute, we're not going to spin. We're not going to give up. We're not going to despair. And the greatest gift that Theodor Herzl gave to the Jewish people, and it's a gift, by the way, that I think we need in democracies today, is after thousands of years of leaps of faith, and we still need a leap of faith, he gave us a leap of hope. And what is a leap of hope? A leap of hope is that tomorrow will be better than today, but it's on us to roll up our sleeves and make it happen. I find there's too much despair in Israel today. I find there's too much despair in the United States of America today. I find there's too much despair in the democratic world today. And so reading Herzl reminds us of that leap of hope we need, because we can solve our problems. We can grow out of our problems. We can think out of our problems. We can work together to transcend our problems. But without hope, and if it's just despair, we throw up our hands rather than rolling up our sleeves.
Yeah, that's a fabulous point. And actually, it leads very naturally to my next question, because Herzl was right about so much, but not everything. He really believed that Zionism was the solution to the so-called Jewish problem, which is to say anti-Semitism. Now, sadly, as we know, that hasn't proved to be the case, because it's now Israel that is now acting as the stand-in for traditional tropes of Jew hatred. Why, despite the considerable body of evidence already to be found in history at his time, do you think he was so optimistic about the end of anti-Semitism? Was it a function of just late 19th century liberalism and belief in the arc of progress of mankind, or was it something else?
It's a great question. And by the way, I just have to honor all the work that you've done in fighting contemporary anti-Semitism, because without voices like yours calling people out, we're in trouble and we're lost. But it's interesting because we see that Herzl is always kind of dancing on the edge between hope and despair, dancing on the edge between looking backwards and being depressed and looking forward and being optimistic. And I think that's the same thing in his reading of anti-Semitism. On the one hand, you could read in Herzl how endemic, how systemic anti-Semitism is in the Western mind, and how incurable. And that's why ultimately he says it is a disease that is incurable. It's a disease. It's so convenient. It's so useful for demagogues. It's so convenient. It's so useful for haters. It's so convenient. It's so useful for those who want to create some kind of glue in European society against the other, that they won't give up on it. And that's why he says we have no choice but to acknowledge that we are a people. We have ties to a particular homeland, Palestine, and the rights to establish a state on that homeland. Nevertheless, he did make that leap of hope, and he did think that once we have legitimacy, because he was a romantic, because he so much believed in liberal nationalism, he thought, that will solve the Jewish problem. So he got it half right. He was right that we needed to go home. He was less right that by having a home, they would stop hating us.
Yeah. I think, we read Alte Neuland, which was his sort of utopian, futuristic novel about the future of the Jewish state that he envisioned. Not as well known as, the Jewish state, but I think just as important. And of course, contemporary critics or everybody then and from then on pokes fun at it or points to anomalies or contradictions in it. But it is that very optimistic vision about the Jewish future in spite of everything. And really, it's about the optimism about the human condition, I think, as much as anything else.
In many ways, it's a classic utopian novel of the 19th century, but
especially the 1890s,
right?
Turn
1890s,
of the 20th
right?
Century,
And as you said, of liberalism,
there were so many at that time.
But it's also a very deeply Jewish book, because Alte Neuland, right? What is that? Old new, and that's what we're constantly doing. We're dancing also between the old and the new. Beryl Katznelson, a Zionist in the 1930s and 1940s, who died tragically before the state, and so he didn't have some cool job, so we don't really remember him. Beryl Katznelson writes this amazing essay about revolution and tradition. He says every human being needs the capacity to forget and the capacity to remember. What a beautiful description of Alte Neuland, of old new. We can't innovate if we only remember, so we need to forget. But we don't know who we are, and we can't really find meaning if we forget everything. And that's the tension of the Jewish condition. That's the tension in Zionism. And that's the tension, of course, in the human condition.
Yeah. Well, the Holocaust ultimately proved the wisdom of Herzl's, vision, or his worries about the future of European Jewry and the need for a Jewish state. But it seems as if the debate about Zionism, which certainly, in the West had been largely silenced for the first decades after the show, is now louder than ever, with much of the intersectional left, which dominates academia, as well as the international human rights community and the UN, embracing anti-Zionism. It's like anytime if you see the phrase Zionism trending on Twitter, sort of click on it at your peril. Why do you think anti-Zionism seems to be gaining on the international stage and in support among Western elites at the very moment when Israel is stronger than ever and now creating even new alliances in the Arab and Muslim world?
The conservative writer George Will had a great line, and it has to do with your line about Israel being stronger than ever. He said, Israel did a terrible thing in 1967. It won. It won at a time when the world was falling in love with losers. And it won at a time when Israel itself was now going to be perceived as an occupier, as an oppressor, without anybody seeing the nuance. Bernard-Henri Lévy, the French philosopher, adds another interesting insight from the 1990s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, how do I show that I'm a lefty? How do I show that I'm part of this worldwide mass virtue signal that is enlightened and sophisticated? It used to be I worshipped communism. Well, that didn't work. So now I worship the Palestinians. And that is why the Palestinians have gotten such a pass on so many things. So the Palestinians were able to position themselves because they were sitting on, unfortunately, this ugly history of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as the great victims of the world. So on the one hand, we have the problem of non-Jewish anti-Zionism, which comes from this attempt to now have an identity marker to show, we are part of the conspiracy, the happy conspiracy against materialism and against imperialism and against settler colonialism now, and all these new buzzwords. I call this a form of cultural imperialism because what they're doing is they're taking their critique of the West and they're imposing it on little complicated Israel. Israel has deep ties to the territories. So when you call Israel settler colonialist, or now this disgusting word which comes from the Nazis, white supremacist or Jewish supremacist, you're simply taking your critique of the West,
which is being used by a lot of Jews right now,
and that's what even gets worse, and you're imposing it on the Jewish people in an incorrect way. So now we have this problem of Jewish anti-Zionism, and Natan Sharansky and I called these people the un-Jews. They're not ex-Jews. They're not as a Jews. They're Jews who are often taking leadership positions to try to undo the core consensus we've had since the 1940s that the Jews are a people, not just a religion, and that we have ties to a particular state and the rights to establish a state on that homeland. Now, here's the question. Why is it that Jews, especially now, have embraced this anti-Zionism? And unfortunately, I think we also get to identity. As a professor, how else can I show how hip I am? My earlobes aren't big enough for enough earrings. My skin isn't wide enough and long enough for enough tattoos. But as soon as I bash Israel, I'm in. I've joined the club. I'm sophisticated. I'm enlightened. And that's a tragedy, and that's a betrayal.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of, I think, the crucial debates in American society is about critical race theory and sort of the way, intersectionality has sort of taken over so much of the discussion, in which, the Palestinian war against Israel is now, likened to the struggle for civil rights, and everybody is divided into, victims and oppressors. And since, as you say, the Jews did a terrible thing and won in 1967, rather than, see their state destroyed, Jews are, widely considered to be, white oppressors, and sort of the other, and to be scorned. And this plays a part. I mean, we have these battles about ethnic studies. There's an important lawsuit going on in California about curricula, which is basically is premised on the idea that Jews are not a people, that Zionism is not integral to Jewish identity and even to Judaism. This contradicts 30 centuries of history and Jewish practice, but it's a stand that is treated as legitimate, not just on the far left, but in major publications. This is now something that is debated in a way that, say, 20, 30 years ago, it was not debated.
And Jews have helped mainstream it. We have what I call
specifically the new Jews.
Right. These un-Jews are the new diasporists. And part of it is an arrogance that the world that I'm living in and the life that I'm living is not just my best life, but the best life. And so I cannot conceive of a world in which Israel, the Jewish state, would dare to say, as Ahad Ha'am said, that Israel is the center. No, no, no. If I'm living in America, I have to be the center. We have to be the center. And it's too threatening. And so what I have to do is I have to decenter, if you will, Israel. And in order to do that, I basically have to strip Israel not only of its centrality because of the connection to the land, but I also have to take us out of being a people. And you're absolutely right. I mean, this notion that Jews are white, when walk down the streets of Israel and you see, by the way, there are dark-skinned Israelis and light-skinned Palestinians, so it's not a racial conflict. Further, injecting American terms, Western terms, in the most arrogant of ways into our little conflict, into our complex life. And it is an act of such arrogance. And the Jews who are doing it, who are many of our top rabbis these days, our top Jewish studies professors these days, our Israel studies professors these days, echoing this kind of language is also an act of laziness. Because you want to criticize Israel, fine. Why use those words? Why steal the language of the attack on Westernism, as I was saying? And why, frankly, echo the words of the Palestinians? Use different language to make your same points. But no, that's the tell, right? That shows that they're really not trying to trigger a thoughtful conversation about what Israel does and doesn't do. They're trying to join the pylon about what Israel is and against what Israel is, and show how much they belong in the world of the sophisticates.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Another interesting point, and this is relating to Herzl and his conception and championing of Zionism, is how does Herzl come across now to a growing religious population in Israel? I mean, in the last election, 26% of the votes were cast for religious parties, including the one on the right that didn't make it into the Knesset. The Haredi population is growing and continue and has real power and certainly real clout in the current government. Has had real clout in most governments in the last half century. How does his vision, as you say, of a liberal, sort of a liberal nationalism, how does that fit into against there are obviously different points of view. How does that fit into sort of the Haredi view of Israel and Zionism? How does it fit with sort of the modern Orthodox Zionism, of the Nationalist Party, the religious Zionist Party, and its offshoots? Where's the nexus there between the iconic Herzl and the way and the sort of the more religious Israel, which is not the Israel, the very secular Israel of Ben Gurion, or even of Jabotinsky, quite frankly, quite frankly, Netanyahu was also a secular Jew. Where's the connection there? How is that worked? How does their visions work together with his vision?
For those ultra-Orthodox who are anti-Zionist, and that's not all ultra-Orthodox, but many of the ultra-Orthodox are anti-Zionist. For them,
as opposed to non-Zionist.
Non-Zionist, right.
Yeah.
Herzl is a problem, and Herzl is evil. One of the things they like to say is, he had no Jewish grandchildren. Well, the truth is, he had no grandchildren because he had this tragic life. He died at the age of 44. His wife dies a few years later. His daughter, Paulina, his oldest, dies of a morphine overdose in Paris. His son Hans commits suicide a week later, and the youngest daughter Trudy dies in Theresienstadt. So it was a star-crossed family, just like George Washington, the father of America, was sterile. Herzl wasn't sterile, but he had no direct descendants after that first generation. So, but what does it show? He had no Jewish grandchildren, saying, "Oh, he was a goy." That shows the goyishness, the non-Jewishness of the Jewish state. That he was just trying to create a state of Jews, not a Jewish state. With religious Zionists, it's more complex and it's more interesting. And one of the exciting things about doing this deep dive into Herzl was seeing his own identity struggle, reading beautiful stories like his story, The Menorah, where he talks about a Jew who was so cut off from Israel, from Judaism, and then he brings a menorah into his home, and first 2 candles, then 3 candles. By the end of the Hanukkah, there are 9 candles bringing in light into his home, and that symbolizes the light that came into his life. Those are stories that modern Orthodox Jews can relate to. Those are stories that modern Orthodox Jews want to tell. And so there's actually a kind of reinterpretation of Herzl going on. And I'm hoping that this book and this conversation will help them understand that. And that gets to the point I was saying earlier, that Herzl, like the song Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Jerusalem of Gold, can be a song that we all sing. And even if in our heads we have a slightly different connection, a slightly different motivation, that's the glue that we need in healthy nationalism. That's the glue that we need in healthy communities. That's the glue that we still see in Israel today for all the headlines about division and about democracy falling apart, and that we're sometimes missing in much of America today.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, all the major Israeli parties sort of trace their lineage, at least the non-Haredi ones, in one way or another, trace their lineage to Herzl. That was true of, certainly Labor and its offshoots, and it's certainly true of Likud. But it's getting to accept that he is the common father, this common vision, is the hard part, and that sort of leads into the debate we're having right now in the Jewish world about Israel's new government, and the predictions about the end of democracy are dominating Jewish discourse right now. I know when we last spoke, which was a year and a half ago or somewhere around then, you were supportive of the previous multi-party coalition that had replaced Netanyahu in 2021. Do you share the fears of others who also backed that government but claim that Israeli democracy is being destroyed by Netanyahu's new right-wing religious coalition? And what do you think the impact of this kind of rhetoric on the already shaky relationship between Israel and American Jewry might be?
I share the critique, but not the hysteria. I think that the fears are so overblown. First of all, I'm a historian. I say it's hard enough to predict the past. I can't begin to predict the future. And the fact that we had 2 months from the time that the government was elected, before it even took office, and people were lamenting and saying Kaddish and mourning the death of Israeli democracy. It's a funny thing. When I lose, I always mourn the death of democracy. When I win, I toast the effectiveness of democracy. It's not healthy. And there is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Despair breeds despair. Laments about the death of democracy lead people to question democracy. And one of the things I've been doing is I've been reading Alexis de Tocqueville, who wandered around America in the 19th century and came up with this wonderful phrase called habits of the heart. And there's a thoughtful educational philosopher in America today named Parker Palmer, who gave a critique of what's going on in America today and used the framework of habits of the heart to say, hey, wait a minute. In America, we don't have strong families. In America, we don't have a strong sense of community. In America, we don't have a strong sense of shared destiny. In America, we don't really talk to one another. And as I read through his article, I said, wow, in Israel, for all its problems, we have a strong sense of family and a strong sense of community and shared holidays and shared enemies and a shared sense of connectedness. And I go to weddings and I almost always see Haredim there and secular Jews there. You certainly walk into hospitals and you see people talking to one another. We don't have the same big sort that's going on in the United States of America. And I don't mean to bash America. America obviously has a lot of wonderful things going on in its democracy today. But I think the hysteria and the sky is falling, what I'm calling the chicken liberals, calling from the United States.
Chicken little liberals.
Yeah, chicken, right? From the United States claiming that, Israeli democracy is imploding is A, premature, vastly premature, and B, a dramatic overreaction. And the irony of ironies is that my liberal friends in America, who've been yelling and screaming for the last couple of months about an all-powerful court, have even considered packing the court from 9 to 15, forgetting what Franklin Roosevelt learned in the 1930s, which is you don't mess with things like the Constitution in that way, are now saying, oh, Israel needs a strong court. Well, what is it? A strong court or a weak court? Or do you simply need a court that does what I want it to do? And
I think we both know the answer to that question.
Truly dangerous to confuse a critique of the institutions and of the governing structures with a critique of the partisan agenda of those who happen to have power at a given time. And I keep on saying that, governments, especially in Israel, are like speedboats, right? We did see a massive change between this coalition of change, as they called it, for this broad-based coalition for a year and a half, and this new government. But democracy itself is a stately ship. It's an ocean liner, and it doesn't shift so quickly. And
it's hard to turn around.
It's hard to turn around for better and for worse. right? And so Bibi Netanyahu was very carefully playing that game when he allowed, it didn't happen in the New York Times. The New York Times ignored it, and the Washington Post downplayed it. But on the day that Bibi Netanyahu formed his sixth government, which is quite extraordinary, he allowed the Israeli press and the Israeli TV, which I was watching, I was glued to the TV, to let the story be Amir Ohana emerging as Speaker of the House, a gay right-wing Likud legislator who publicly in the Knesset acknowledged his husband and his two children. And that was Bibi Netanyahu's way of saying, you know what? There are underlying forces in this democracy that make it democratic, lowercase d, that aren't going to change so quickly. And that I myself am, as he said in many of his interviews, and too many of them were in English, not enough of them were in Hebrew, I'm a 19th century Democrat. And so there's a game going on here. And ultimately, I'm not sure what's going to happen. I don't know how effective this coalition will be, because we're already seeing fights between the Haredim who say, hey, wait a minute, how can we allow road repairs and railroad repairs to continue on the Sabbath? And secular Likudnikim who don't want to get stuck in traffic on Sunday, or even worse, have constituents stuck in traffic on Sunday because they couldn't get road repair done on Saturday, and start yelling and screaming at them. So I think there'll be fissures in the coalition, which nobody wants to predict. The right wing doesn't want to predict it because they want to.
This is a perennial argument too.
Right,
I mean, this
right.
isn't anything
so
new.
These are things, right? So the right wing wants to.
Rabin had to deal with these kinds of issues.
Yeah, it goes back, and he lost a coalition over it, right? So the right wants to pretend that they're one solid coalition. The left wants to spin itself into some hysteria, and it undermines the left's credibility. It's much more effective to argue point by point than to always be yelling and screaming that democracy is over because you happen to lose.
Yeah, well, I think that's very true. I mean, I think we both know that people complain about the decline of democracy generally when the results of democracy don't go their way, and I think that's true no matter where you live. But I think just to get back to the point that I was trying to ask about, this critique of Israel as an anti-democratic, now becoming an anti-democratic state. Comparing it, I mean, you don't even have to read just Haaretz and some of the sort of anti-Zionist columnists in that newspaper to hear comparisons as if this new government is little different from the Ayatollahs running Iran. I think that has a real impact in the debate about Israel in the United States, especially at a time when we're really struggling to maintain, or at least to try and create, more support for Israel among young Jews who have sort of grown up in a very secular and sort of view anything that is sectarian as somehow racist. It bothers me that there are some very strong Zionist leaders, Zionist thinkers in Israel, Zionists who consider themselves centrists or people of the left, who are not sort of not stopping to think of the consequences of this kind of labeling on the broader debate, about Zionism, which, where we started with this conversation, where Zionism is under siege in the virtual public square. Zionism is under siege in international forums, even as Israel is so strong and such a power. These kinds of arguments resonate. They don't just provide fodder for sort of Palestinian trolls on Twitter. I think they have a fundamental effect on how the Jewish community, certainly in North America, thinks about the Jewish state.
I was on a speaking tour in the U.S. a few weeks ago, and I was asked by somebody, a leader of his congregation. He says, when I hear on the radio and television about what's going on in Israel, it sounds to me exactly like the modesty police and Iran, exactly what you said. So I said to him, I said to him lovingly, respectfully, I sentence you to take a walk on the Tel Aviv beach and then come back to me and tell me about the modesty police. Like, you're right. There's a lack of sense of proportion. And I agree with you. Look, I'm torn, because as a Zionist, I think it's really important that in Israel, we have a healthy, effective partisan debate, and that we yell and scream in Hebrew and in English at one another to figure it out. Just what balance should we have between the Knesset and the court? Just what balance should we have between the Jewishness of the state and free democracy? Those are important debates to have. But I also agree with you that we cannot afford to forget how our debate is listened into and eavesdropped and often distorted in a very unhealthy way, in a very poisonous way. And that's part of the reason why I've disagreed respectfully with some of my centrist friends who have been yelling and screaming and chicken littling here and there. And I keep on saying, why this apocalypse? And again, I think it undermines the left here in Israel, because the language that we saw, for example, there was a rally on Saturday night, and some say 10,000, some say 30,000. Again, depending on,
it's the usual Israeli.
Right.
Donald Trump isn't
Right.
the only one who inflates the number of people who goes to his events.
So you want to criticize the new Justice Minister Levin, and fine, but say coup d'état when we've had not just one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 elections uncontested with peaceful transitions in the last 3 years. Why use the phrase coup d'état? There was some Hitler imagery there, which is never acceptable in the Jewish state. And why are you so unhinged? Why are you so insecure and so uncomfortable with your effective arguments? They have to go to this kind of apocalyptic stuff. As I say, it undermines credibility, and it also, as you say, undermines our legitimacy.
Well, I think part of it, just to digress for a moment, is because I think some of the people sort of taking that tack, or sort of people of the left and the Zionist left, has a strong tradition, a right to speak up and say what they like and what they don't like. But I think they also sense that the sort of demographic tide is turning against them, that Israel is a more, in American terms, Israel is kind of a red state. It is a center-right country. The left has not won an election outright. I mean, it depends, in 2006, sort of that centrist Sharon party that, Sharon founded Kadima, that, died a quick death without him. They won an election. If you want to call them a government of the left, I'm not sure that was true, but the left doesn't seem to have good prospects coming up. And I think there's a sense among some of its supporters that if they can't win elections, then they got to somehow turn over the chess table, if they can't win the game, which is not democratic, but it is worrisome.
Yes, and again, the focus on election results misses the fact that, for example, there's been a huge revolution in the last 30, 40 years in attitudes towards women, towards gays, toward Arabs. And I keep on saying also to people, I say, pick a year in Israeli history that you'd rather be living in than 2023 as an Arab, as a secular Jew, as a member of the gay community. I can't find a better time to be living than this moment, for all its challenges, for all the worries. And it's also, complicated in Israel because, many of the people who might vote red, as we would call it in American terms, might vote conservative, might be tattooed and earringed Tel Avivis who are worried about security. There are all kinds of reasons that go on. And again, I think part of the distortion that occurred in the American Jewish conversation and the broader world conversation about this recent election was that because since March, people haven't been focusing on the fact that there's been a surge in violence in Israel. Because it's not a convenient story, because the surge in violence comes from the Palestinians. The surge in violence began after Ramadan. And so began during Ramadan. And people said, oh, you Jews, you're against Ramadan. We said, we're not the ones who started the violence during Ramadan. We're not being disrespectful of Ramadan. You're being disrespectful of Ramadan, right? And so because people, unlike you, and unlike your JNS service, have not been reporting that story. And when I go around and I talk about that awful terrorist attack in Jerusalem just a few weeks ago, where a 16-year-old Toronto Israeli boy was killed, and a 50-year-old Ethiopian Israeli father of 6, whom we just call an Israeli, was killed. And people say, I didn't know about that. Well, so then maybe you can understand why there was a fear of voting left, and there's a desire to vote right. Maybe it doesn't have to do with your fantasy about what's going on in America, just as you impose the race issue on from America, and maybe it has to do with some of the security issues going on here in Israel. And I say that as someone who was a critic of Ben Gvir. I say that as someone who doesn't think that Ben Gvir is the answer. But I also say that as someone who understands that some of my fellow Israelis might see him as the answer, given their fear and frustration about what's going on. So when you don't see the full picture, it's very easy to jump to the conclusions that work in your little world, in your little way.
Yeah, I think that's very true. That's right to the point. Sort of among my final questions here, I want to sort of turn back to Herzl for a moment. I think we would like. I think I'd like to see everybody get that book. Get that new set. It looks good. I know I'm going to be purchasing it. It's expensive, but yeah, I think it looks wonderful. It will go right behind me next to my collection of Herzl diaries and Herzl biographies that you can see in the bookshelf behind me. That's not a Zoom thing. That's this is my real library. But what is the one thing that you want everybody to know, remember about Herzl? Even for the unfortunately many who will not buy or read all of his Zionist writings, what is the one thing you want them to know about him?
The cliche of Herzl is, if you will it, it is no dream. And that's a cliche because it really was the message, the leap of hope that came from Herzl, the fulfillment of the dream. Anytime things look bleak, just turn back the clock in Jewish history to 125 years ago or 126 years ago and see how much bleaker things were then. And as we go in through this, what I called earlier, the arc of Zionist triumph, as I hope all of us have ice cream for breakfast on Yom Ha'atzmaut, on Israel Independence Day, so we start the day with a sweet taste in our mouth, we appreciate that for all the challenges of today, we're really lucky to be living at this moment in this world, thanks to the vision of Herzl and so many others. And so I hope the Herzl volumes will be a spur to believe, to take that leap of hope, to know that things sometimes look bleak, but by working together, by thinking together, by dreaming together, and rolling up our sleeves to make our dreams come true, the world can become a better place, and the Jewish world can become a better place.
Well, that's a wonderful thought, and I think we all like the idea of ice cream for breakfast on Yom Ha'atzmaut. I think I'm going to put that down on my calendar. Everybody else, do the same. And Gil, I want to thank you so much for your insights on these important issues, and good luck with the publication and what goes forward with the new Jewish library. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us now on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.